Hello, and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead. The podcast has now been downloaded 600 times in 35 countries, so please keep recommending the podcast to others by sharing it on social media. Boris Yeltsin is the subject of today's episode. If you haven't heard of him, you will definitely have heard of his successor as President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Boris Yeltsin was the first president of Russia from 1991 until his resignation on the final day of the last millennium. Yeltsin's rule oversaw the end of the Soviet Union, the largest experiment in state socialism in history, and the beginning of the modern-day Russian Federation, a capitalist country with questionable democratic credentials. If you have heard of Yeltsin, you will probably know him as a drunk. Indeed, Yeltsin struggled with alcohol dependency throughout his time in office, leading to a series of embarrassing gaffes. Once, as an orchestra was playing during Yeltsin's visit to Germany, the Russian president memorably began dancing drunkenly and pretended to conduct the orchestra. However, such amusing moments conceal the decay and ruin that Russia experienced on Yeltsin's watch. The transition from Soviet socialism to Western capitalism and democracy was challenging, with living standards in Russia falling more dramatically than Western living standards during the Great Depression of the 1930s. All too often, as Russia staggered from one crisis to another, Yeltsin seemed oddly detached from the country's problems, unable to provide the stability his citizens craved, and paving the way for the strong state authoritarian rule of Vladimir Putin. In 1999, the year Yeltsin resigned the presidency, his approval rating was just 6%. However, for many, the Yeltsin of 1991 will always be remembered fondly as the man who did more than any other to consign the Soviet Union to history and gave Russians the chance to live in a free society. My guest for today's conversation is Dr Marc Berenson, who works at the Russia Institute of King's College London. Marc is an old lecturer of mine, and in 2019 he published the book Taxes and Trust, which is an examination of the different fates of Russia, Ukraine and Poland in the post-communist era. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Boris Yeltsin. Morning, Marc. How are you?
Doing great here, thanks.
Brilliant. You're in London?
I'm actually in Brighton, and they're starting to pick up the garbage after the strike, so it's going to be a great week.
Oh, good. You must be really relieved.
I am, yeah.
You've been studying the Soviet Union and its successor countries since before the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, Marc. In short, why is it this period of Russian history and economics that still interests you so much above the others?
It's a moment of great transition and great change. Speaking about Yeltsin and his legacy in particular, it provided for great achievements in moving towards capitalism, democracy, and the end of an empire. And for those of us looking on the outside in, there was great hope and great promise that this transition would enable Russia to join Western nations on equal terms as a democratic capitalist state. And the welfare of so many people across the former Soviet Union that had become basically impoverished towards the end of the Soviet days would be improved significantly.
And perhaps not in reality, of course. The leader of Russia at this time, as you said, was Boris Yeltsin during the 1990s. He becomes the leader of a new country in 1991. He's the subject of our conversation today, and he was born in 1931 during the Stalin era. He had a very difficult upbringing. His father was quite violent. His grandfather was accused by the government of being a kulak, a sort of wealthy capitalist farmer, and he died in a labour camp. Yeltsin's membership of the Communist Party begins when he's about 30 in 1960, probably the time when the Soviet Union is at its most stable and economically prosperous. Can you describe for people who don't know much about the history of the Soviet Union, what was the country like during the early 1960s?
Sure. I just want to slightly correct you on his grandparents. All four of them were affected by the Stalin terrors.
Okay.
And all four of them were actually labeled as kulaks in one way or another. And a kulak was a slightly wealthier peasant. And Yeltsin's family came from a small town, probably equidistant between Kazan in Tatarstan and Yekaterinburg, or what was known as Sverdlovsk in the Soviet days. And so it was a horrible background, perhaps not totally uncommon for a lot of citizens of Russia at that time. Yeltsin certainly came up in the system through Sverdlovsk in Yekaterinburg. And in the 1960s, you had this opening, this thaw that was occurring as a result of the fact that Stalin had left and had died in the scene in 1953, and was replaced by Khrushchev, who was more tolerant of a greater degree of openness. Certainly not to the extent that Gorbachev would push for in the late 1980s, but those who were of this 1960s sort of generation, the Shishyatyniki, which included both Gorbachev and Yeltsin, were deemed to sort of grow up in a time where they could question things a bit more and challenge things a bit more. And this was thanks to Khrushchev. Certainly once Brezhnev came into power in the 60s, replacing Khrushchev, and Khrushchev was taken down basically from that position as head of the Soviet Union, more restrictions were in place, and the thaw sort of began to refreeze, if you will. But the generation of Soviet leaders who sort of had their coming of age in the 1960s were able to be more questioning, critiquing, engage in more critical thought than ever before as to how the system is working or not working. At the same time, of course, Yeltsin was part of the system. He was brought into Moscow in the mid to late 80s by Gorbachev to head the local party committee of Moscow, which was the largest, of course, party committee in the country. And he had not bucked the system in any way prior to that. So there, in many ways, there was no sign of him being or having a rebellious streak, if you will. And he was already well into his middle ages when he came to Moscow.
And what was the context of Soviet politics by the mid-1980s? Because it's quite a different situation to, say, 20 years prior in lots of ways, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, politically, you had a process in which three Soviet leaders passed away within a year or two of each other. And this created a sense of sort of political unease, perhaps affecting some sense of self-legitimacy of the communists at the start of the system. So in March 1985, Gorbachev, who was quite a relatively young man in his, I believe, 60s, compared to, no, he would have been in his 50s rather, compared to the other leaders who had been quite sickly. He was a different character altogether. And when Gorbachev came to power, he began to realize that the system was not working, the economy was not doing well, and he recognized that a moderate changes, gradual reforms of the system were not going to fix the problems. So he set about undertaking two key policies. One is called perestroika and the other is called glasnost. Perestroika was economic restructuring, changing of the bureaucrats, changing of the way in which there was some accountability in the systems so that the economy could be moving again, eventually allowing for some private property, to be tolerated in the Soviet system. And glasnost which translates directly as openness, was about sort of more tolerance, more openness, to be able to discuss things. And as a result of this, especially with respect to glasnost, the system sort of developed a problem, because under glasnost, it became possible for people to question the Soviet state, to question especially Stalinism, and learn about all the crimes and publicize the crimes of Stalinism that took place in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and early 50s. And once that was done, once it was possible to critique the Stalin years, some people began to realize they could critique the Lenin years. And there was a play, for example, by Mikhail Shatrov on the Moscow stage about this time called Onward, Onward, Onward. And the main character in this play gets on the stage and says, look, we've uncovered the problems that were inherent in the Soviet system under Stalin. Let's just move forward now and onward with Marxism, Leninism, and building communism. And don't consider the crimes and issues of Lenin. But the problem is the cat was sort of already out of the bag. Once you allow for this sort of open discussion and open dialogue, the whole legitimacy of the whole system became sort of undermined, because you could question whether Lenin himself was responsible for so much of the crimes that happened at the beginning of the country's foundation. And if you could question the foundation of the country, you could question the whole system itself.
And how does Yeltsin react to, or some might say take advantage of, this, I suppose, quite destabilizing situation?
So Yeltsin begins to recognize that Gorbachev isn't moving fast enough. And he also sees a political opportunity for himself to critique Gorbachev's speed with respect to the reforms. And in doing so, take away the sort of liberal branch of those who were within the Communist Party that wanted change, and leave Gorbachev, who used to be sort of at the center between the liberals and the conservatives within the Communist Party, together only with the conservatives. And this wasn't a good sort of political basis for Gorbachev himself to stand on, but more so, Yeltsin recognized that you need to have radical sort of change happen, and that sort of small steps were not going to be needed. So initially, he was a non-voting member of the Politburo, and was obviously a leading communist. He initially withdrew from government positions. Then, as Gorbachev began to recognize that Gorbachev himself could not get legitimacy or support for his reforms, the economic reforms he's been undertaking. So Gorbachev opened up the political system, began to have elections that could be free and contested, even during the late Soviet period. As a result, Yeltsin ran for office and eventually became head of the Russian Federation in June 1991. And as a result of that, Yeltsin got a political base on which basis of support for which he could stand to push forward for more sort of radical things.
And this is a problem because it's created two competing power blocks within the same country. You've got the old Soviet Union still led by Gorbachev, but you've also got this new state within a state which has a mandate led by Boris Yeltsin as the 80s ends and the 90s starts. How does this situation end such that by 91 only one of those two power blocks, as it were, is still standing?
I mean, obviously, there are many countries in the world in which there is a leader of the entire country, and then provinces or subnational units have governors or presidents who work well within the whole system. Yeltsin's mission was, he recognized along that period of time that what needed to be done was radical economic reform, because the population was not doing well socioeconomically. And he also recognized that not only should the republics of the former Soviet Union have the right to secede from the Soviet Union, but that the Russian Federation itself had the right to secede. And he made sort of this nationalist plea for seceding based upon the right to succeed, as well as pushing for more radical economic reforms. And this is what sort of makes Yeltsin the key figure, no matter what happens after this. 1991 is the year in which Yeltsin seeks to change the system from communism to a capitalist market economy, seeks to change the country from an empire to a nation state, and do so without claiming any sort of ethnic nationalism. And then thirdly, he becomes elected, the first sort of democratically elected leader in Russia's history. And so he's moving this triple transition. He's at the center of those three changes. And when, by the end of 1991, sort of the climax of this, Yeltsin gets together, he invites the leaders of several of the other former Soviet republics, who were then part of the Soviet Union, together to a dacha, if you will, in western Belarus, in the Bielovesia forest, which is the oldest forest still in existence in Europe. It's also shares land in Poland as well, well worth a visit. Very beautiful part of the continent. And while there was a lot of vodka and drinks consumed at this dacha meeting, he convinces them all that they should each sort of claim the right to succeed, that they should sign in declarations of independence. And when this happens, and Yeltsin does the same as well on behalf of the Russian Federation, Gorbachev is left to be president of a country, the Soviet Union, that had no member states. And so he was no longer head of really anything. So by the end of the year, he stepped down. I think December 25th, 1991, he steps down as leader of the Soviet Union. And immediately in January 1992, the shock therapy and the radical economic reform program that Yeltsin was in favor of got started with the help of some liberal Russian economists like Gaidar and
it's worth, I think, at this point, just reflecting on the dissolution of the Soviet Union, given the huge number of ethnic minorities, different national groups that claimed independence in a relatively short period of time. The fact that, of course, the dissolution wasn't bloodless. There were definitely conflicts that arose as a result of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But the relative lack of bloodshed is amazing in lots of ways, don't you think? Because I always look at it and think that it's remarkable that there weren't more problems that arose as a result of this.
Well, I suppose you could look at this lack of violence issue from a number of different ways. For one, there was violence in Tbilisi, in Vilnius, and Gorbachev, who was really mostly taking a hands-off position. He did send troops into those places, and there was some small bloodshed. And the other thing is, and yes, it was remarkable that at the very moment of the time, and this was probably credit to Yeltsin, because he argued that the Russian Federation had the right to secede, not on ethnic national terms, but on sort of national terms, nation-state terms. And so this was a much more sort of tolerant dissolve of the empire than what you perhaps saw in the former Yugoslavia. And the reason was that Yeltsin pushed forward for succession with reform, and that did not take place immediately in the former Yugoslavia. Further, though, long term, if you think about sort of the last several decades, there's been a lot of violence. There's been a lot of war in this part of the world. You may say it's a delayed reaction to the breakup of the Soviet Union. Certainly, a lot of the motive of Putin, in terms of his involvement in the near abroad, those countries that were part of the Soviet Union that have become independent since then, is done out of the sort of belief that what happened in the 90s was wrong. The breakup of the Soviet Union was wrong, that Russia, unfortunately, and with great regret, lost a lot of its sort of legitimacy in the world stage because it lost all of these former Soviet lands. And so the sort of, it's been described as a person who has lost a limb and still believes the limb is there. And Russians look with regret to the fact that a lot of the former Soviet territories are not part of their empire, if you will, anymore. And I think that that is a strong reason for a lot of the violence since 1991. But there's also been other causes as well. There's been ethnic nationalist violence, certainly between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And one can qualify a lot of the other conflicts around the Soviet perimeter as being related to more than just Russia's involvement.
That's fair enough. I wouldn't deny that there's been a lot of violence since, of course, but I mean, what I mean about the fact that it's amazing that there wasn't more bloodshed is that in the moment of 1991-92 that there wasn't ethnic violence on the level of, say, Yugoslavia or the partition of the British Raj, for example.
No, look at the situation that's been occurring in the last couple of years in Belarus. We find that while there hasn't been full-blown war there, there's been some violence on the part of the state as Lukashenko has tried to maintain his power there, even after losing an election. And at the same time, this is a struggle of something that never got fully resolved when the Soviet Union fell apart. So whether you call it sort of, pangs of phantom pangs of lost limbs, or whether you refer to it as a crisis that has been sort of slowly coming to a boil over the last few decades, this is a period of time in which we're seeing a transition that's still occurring. Kind of like after a volcano erupts, there'll still be some land movements afterwards, even after the main eruption has sort of faded down. And, we wonder, because we're in the middle of it right now, as to when things will become more resolved. Borders will be respected completely and made finite.
The Soviet Union, as you said, is gone by Christmas 1991. Yeltsin's the president of an independent country, the Russian Federation. This is a country that advances the principles of glasnost and perestroika and is determined to transition to a democratic capitalist model. But Russia's transition to being a sort of Western-style capitalist democracy in the 90s doesn't go well.
No, it doesn't. And for Yeltsin's part, it's not really clear to what extent he understood the nature of the economic reforms process. He regarded essentially when the economic reforms were to take place at the beginning of 1992, that they would benefit the population as a whole. He didn't conceive of there being pockets of society that would benefit and other pockets of society that would really not benefit. So those who benefit at the beginning seem to benefit throughout the whole process, crowding out the losers, if you will. Yeltsin did not think in those terms. Of course, maybe in retrospect, not many people sort of did until the late 1990s. But the two aspects of the economic reform programs that had this sort of biggest salience, that had the biggest impact, was this sort of macroeconomic stabilization series of financial reforms, but also the privatization process. And the privatization process, in many ways, benefited a group of insiders, those who were in control of factories, of firms, those who had the knowledge as to what was being sold when and where, were able to take part in these auctions that were, in many cases, rigged and enabled a small group of winners to emerge that controlled a large portion of the economy. And of course, that privatization process, which for an economist on paper sounds great because economists recognize the need to just create property. Doesn't matter who out in society is receiving that property or is the owner of that property, but by the mere fact that property is created in a system where before all of the property was owned by the state, all the factories, all the enterprises, all of the firms are owned by the state, suddenly you have owners who would have a real interest in making sure that their companies, their firms would become profitable. This was viewed as heralded at the beginning of the 90s as a great thing, but by the end of the 90s, it was realized that only a small portion of the population benefited from this. And this enabled the rise of the oligarchs, which also really came into their own with the loans for shares agreement that happened in, just before Yeltsin's reelection in 1996. And the loans for shares agreement was that the oligarchs loaned small amounts of money to the state. They really just gave the state some money because the state needed money, and Yeltsin needed money as well for his reelection campaign. And at the same time, they took shares, they took ownership of big state firms, which were far more valuable than what they were giving in return for that. And this sort of created the mega oligarchs of sort of Hodorkovsky, Berezovsky, and the others who we look back as sort of the 1990s as sort of the main sort of economic powerhouses that were created from this new transformation to some form of market capitalism.
Was this corruption, Mark, or was it the way that the system was designed to work?
I think that a lot of the questions with respect to what happened being corrupt or non-corrupt may be taken from a sort of an outsider's perspective without necessarily considering whether things were being done in accordance with the laws at the time. The problem with the whole transformation in the 1990s is that there wasn't much institution building. Judiciary wasn't up and running to adjudicate property disputes, adjudicate what the law meant. And at the same time, you had laws that were held over from the Soviet era at the same time that some new laws were being created, such that it was a very uncertain time as to where things stood on a legal basis. And as a result of that, people who were in the right place at the right time were able to profit from rent-seeking opportunities. You know, if the rules of the state, for example, were that from the Soviet era, say that if for example, a barrel of oil cost $1 on the internal Soviet market. So if you're a Soviet firm and you're buying from another firm a barrel of oil, you pay $1, basically $1 for it. But once the Soviet Union goes away, these prices still stood at the same time that the borders were opening up, such that if you had access to buy a barrel of oil for $1, you could then ship it across the border, Germany, elsewhere farther, and sell it at the world price, which is $30, $40 a barrel at the time. And so that's a huge profit margin. And it was the lack of or the inability of the legal system, both in terms of the parliament, the Duma passing laws, but also in terms of having the court system set up to independently arbitrate things, that enabled these things to happen. And basically, the main failure that those who have evaluated the economic transition in Russia and elsewhere at the time was that the shock therapy, the radical economic reforms that brought forth this privatization process quite rapidly and quite soon at the beginning of the transformation, brought forward some of the needed macroeconomic reforms to stabilize the economy, did not really create new institutions. These things take time. Giving out shares of a state company, it can be done relatively quickly. Building the whole legal system takes a while.
What is the social effect of the economic crisis that unfolds in Russia during the 1990s? Because it's worth pointing out quite how much the economy shrank in Russia during the 90s. I think it was 56% the size of what it had been in 1989 by 1999. I mean, what are the social effects of this?
So the depression that took place in 1990s Russia and other countries as well in the region was far worse than the depression that took place here in the UK, in the US, and other Western countries in the 1930s. You can imagine if your grandparents or great grandparents have relayed about what it was like going through the 30s and how they were sort of became much more frugal minded and not wanting to spend money as a result of the hardship that happened in the 1930s. It was far worse in Russia, Ukraine, and other states in the 1990s. And as a result of this, you have both horrendous poverty, drastic decline in life expectancy, down to something like 58, 59 years old, roughly, for men by the end of the decade. And that also sets the stage politically for the Putin presidency to take off. And as it does with the at the same time as oil prices becoming much higher in the early 2000s, the economy begins to pick up, which perhaps rightly so, people assume it's related to the fact that Putin has undertaken some major reforms that they're working to the benefit of the population.
The end of the Yeltsin presidency comes off the back of this depression in the 90s. It's fittingly quite chaotic. It sort of corresponds very well to what the rest of his presidency was like. Why does Yeltsin leave office?
He leaves office New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1999, in a speech to the country that was actually taped earlier that morning. And he has a very interesting, remarkable speech because he believes that he's done what he could do, but at the same time he apologizes and asks for forgiveness of the population of the country for what has happened. And this isn't something that sort of we see leaders doing, especially when they step down. No. He had also tried out several different prime ministers and hired and fired a number of them over the recent years, and believed that Putin was the person to take charge. And by resigning on December 31st, 1999, he was able to have the elections for president, which Putin would stand, be moved up from June to March 2000, a shorter period of time for the campaign, enabling Putin to have more likely odds of winning, benefit from being both prime minister in 1999 and then from January 1st, 2000, acting president. In addition, this also takes place after the Second Chechen War has begun. And this war, Yeltsin sort of agreed to in many ways. This was a policy choice of Vladimir Putin in reacting to what was perceived to be at the time domestic terrorism within Russia in late summer of 1999. And Yeltsin probably went along and believed that this war should commence because he felt as if he would get a better deal out of Chechnya than the way in which the 1994 to 96 first war in Chechnya had achieved. In many ways, looking back on 1999, it's a very consequential year for Russia, and it's sort of an opposite bookend to the triple achievements that Yeltsin had made at the beginning of the 1990s. Dissolving the empire, making Russia a nation state, starting economic reforms, drastic sort of radical manner, and also starting democracy in the country by becoming the first leader to be elected in Russia. So this all comes undone both because of the war in Chechnya, which becomes extremely nasty in the ensuing months, but also horrific death toll. And at the same time, he has selected Putin. And he selected Putin in a manner in which he cannot take him out of office the way he could with his previous prime ministers. And that was a choice that may have felt right, obviously felt right for him at the time, but something that he may well have thought differently about during his retirement years.
If we just look at Yeltsin's presidency through the prism of the Putin years, Putin's somebody who in lots of ways receives a lot of bad press in the West, and rightly so. But his appeal is based on something that Yeltsin was never really able to provide Russians, which is stability and control. And rightly or wrongly, a lot of Russians think that he's well placed to deliver those things. And I'm not a supporter of Putin, but I'm never really more sympathetic to him or understanding of him than when I'm reading about Yeltsin, because of what happened under his rule and because of the leader he was in many ways. He was not a particularly capable president. Does the ordeal of the 90s make you view Putin differently at all?
I think that there are things that Yeltsin did and didn't do. He's sort of a character in paradox, as Timothy Colton describes him in his 2007 biography of Yeltsin. There are things that Yeltsin did not do that would have benefited and enabled his achievements to have far-lasting impact beyond the 1990s. One was, of course, the economic reform process, which was not as well understood by most people, quite frankly, at the very beginning. And secondly, he did not engage with Parliament to have sort of a basis for political support. Those few allies he found in Parliament, he actually took out and put as part of the executive branch, which didn't make Parliament any more flexible towards him. And there was this horrific clash between the executive and legislative branches in October 1993 that ended with Yeltsin as president calling on the tanks to fire upon the Parliament building in central Moscow as a way of resolving that crisis. Again, institutions, perhaps a stronger constitutional court system may have been helpful there. But he also didn't make a political party. He didn't create a political party. He didn't believe he needed to be involved in that. So in many ways, he pushed forward sort of in a very radical way to have a break with the past on many key areas, but didn't do sort of the undertow work, so to speak, you call it, to enable that process to have greater legs beyond the 1990s. The reforms led to some horrific economic consequences for the population. It just cannot be understated as to how Russians did suffer in the 1990s, and rightly so regard that era and Yeltsin being in charge of that era as being responsible for it. But Yeltsin also was able to rally back and get reelected. He stopped a challenger who was a communist in 1996 from being elected. Began that year with popularity ratings of just 10% in January 1996, and soon, by June, was able to be reelected. Great help and support from the media and the oligarchs and others as well, of course. But nevertheless, he pushed for sort of putting sort of further nails in the coffin of communism. He wanted never to go back to that.
I really like that idea of a character of paradoxes. I think that works very well because there are things about him which I think are notable, maybe commendable actually. But at the same time, you always get this impression with him of, well, why don't you follow through on things? Why can't you do detail? Why can't you sort of get anybody to work with you? You get that. I got that impression of him when I was reading about him, certainly in the later 90s. I think with Putin and him, you really have to view them alongside each other in the two eras because they're kind of a first and second chapter of what what hopefully will be quite a long Russian Federation free of communism. Um, I mean, the reason I started the podcast with a kind of truncated history of the Soviet Union is that Yeltsin's career as a party member and then as a politician kind of spans the decline of the Soviets and the Russians as a global force. Where do you think Russia will be in 20 years' time as a force upon the world stage and as an economic unit?
I hesitate big time to make any sort of predictions regards to that. I will say that myself and a lot of my contemporaries who began in the 1990s thinking at the wonderful opportunities that Yeltsin had before them in recreating the country, putting opportunity to get rid of poverty, get rid of a lot of hardship, and also make for a democratic capitalist system. I never would have thought 30 years later or so that we would be in the situation we are now when we look upon Russia today. And so I think that Russia 2021 is not a place that people could have accurately, I think, predicted in 1991. So I don't know where Russia will go. In fact, I don't even know where, the UK and the US and other countries are going to be 20 years off from now. Yeltsin was a character who thrived on crisis and responded to it. And he didn't follow up per se on all the details, but that wasn't the type of person he was. And one can only wonder if the Russian Federation had a different political system. And there's been much discussion in the decades following that parliamentary systems did the job of implementing reform and getting the economy and democracy moving much better in the Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union than did presidential systems. And so if Yeltsin was prime minister or sort of a president, head of state, that was like a head of state more than just a politician at the top, it's possible that there would have been other characters, other people involved in government that would have been able to follow up with on these details with greater authority than took place in a presidential system. Moreover, all of this is hindsight, of course, but in order to sort of ameliorate the differences between the winners and losers of economic reform, many have felt that a parliamentary system would be much more successful. And certainly Yeltsin was the zenith of his sort of power and popularity in 1991. He not only was elected in June to become president of the Russian Federation, the first democratically elected leader, but he also stood on top of the tanks in August 1991 and stood down the putsch, this coup attempt, and saved Gorbachev as well at the same time. And at the end of the year, enabled the peaceful demise of the Soviet Union, such that the biggest chunk of it, the Russian Federation, was something that he could lead. Perhaps 6 months, a year after that, and this happened certainly in Central and Eastern Europe, that once reforms were made, there was a change in parliament, in the composition of who was running the country legislatively, and therefore that may have, if that was to be done in a parliamentary system, in Russia, Yeltsin may not have lasted as long as he did into the 1990s. Presidential systems have fixed terms of office. Parliamentary systems do not. And when there is a crisis in a parliamentary system, more often than not, it enables the opportunity for the leader to be changed, either by the ruling party or either by an election decided by the public.
It's been a really good conversation today, Mark. I've enjoyed talking about Yeltsin. If people want to explore this more, if they want to see more of you, or listen to more of you, or read more of you, where should they go?
So I came out with a couple of years ago with a book called Taxes and Trust, from coercion to compliance in Poland, Russia, and Ukraine. And this really illustrates the three trajectories that three different states took in leaving state socialism, and how they built new institutions in order to govern, and they have different outcomes in their ability to govern based upon those decisions. So I recommend that. That's available from Cambridge University Press, and you can find it on their site to read, free to download. And I'm based at the Russia Institute at King's College, London, and we'll be happy to engage with any listeners from there.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mark. Cheers for your time.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to get updates whenever new episodes are released. If you're just on that last stretch of your commute to or from work, or have a spare 2 minutes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to help the podcast grow.